my cognition around it wasn't like, what the hell is wrong with me? Why do I miss him? He hurt me. It was like, of course, I want that hit. That's the nature of addiction and abuse.
Let's dive right in. Joining me today, I have Melissa Fulgieri. Oh, I am so excited. Was sharing her experience with toxic relationships and narcissistic partners and love bombing. So we're going to dive into all this stuff today, which I don't think we hear too many therapists talking about at all. So thank you so much, Melissa, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here and I'm happy to share and support others through their journey.
First and foremost, just offer the resources that you have available right now, which it includes a book.
So, my new book is called Healing Relational Trauma. I wrote this book because what I was realizing in my clinical practice was that so many people were carrying pain from childhood, but because they never felt like it was quote unquote bad enough, they weren't able to label it as trauma and therefore get the right support. Really, what it's ultimately about is how our childhood wounds impact our adult romantic relationships.
Thank you so much for writing this. I can't wait to get my hands on it and read it as well.
It comes out on May 1st. And I wrote this book to be able to really break down all the different ways that we get harmed through our first relationships, which are our relationships with our caregivers. And that really sets the stage for how we seek out and how we feel love in our romantic relationships. And as you might imagine, because we're all imperfect people, obviously things go awry in childhood, and then we see that start to show up when we start to choose romantic partners.
What was your experience during the honeymoon phase and the love bombing? If you can walk us through those initial stages of those relationships that sometimes we choose based off of, as you mentioned, our past attachment styles, things like that.
For those who don't know, love bombing is really that first phase that kicks off the cycle of abuse. And it's part of what makes it so difficult to leave because the love bombing phase, also known as the honeymoon phase, which doesn't have to be abusive, right? But love bombing is sort of the version of it that can become abusive. It feels really amazing, right? Like, I think for me specifically, I've done so much work in my life on building my self-esteem and my self-worth. And so, interestingly enough, when I met someone who was mirroring that back to me through this excessive flattery, instead of it being a red flag, I was sort of like, hell yeah, I am great. Thank you so much for noticing that, right? I had just come from a very long relationship where I was feeling neglected in that way. I felt like my strengths and my light weren't necessarily being appreciated or validated. And so it was extra intoxicating to be getting that love bombing because it was something that I had been missing. And so the love bombing for me, I think more often than not, when we read about love bombing, people talk about these huge gestures, these expensive gifts, but I think it's also really important that depending on someone's socioeconomic status, many people don't have the means for hugely expensive gifts. And so it can sort of be much more insidious when you're dealing with someone who their primary way of love bombing is through the words. To talk about love languages, I'm a words of affirmation person. And so getting those compliments, getting that verbal acknowledgement, that appreciation, that admiration was super intoxicating for me.
And I think the main key here is that mirroring. Like I heard you say they're mirroring, but at the same time, you started recognizing then that some of these behaviors were possible red flags. What helped you to start noticing that since it is very intoxicating?
When you're trying to track on love bombing is understanding the intensity, right? So it feels like a whirlwind. And Dr. Ramani, she's a great narcissistic abuse educator. She talks about it feeling like the sun is in your eyes. You're completely blinded. And so I had a real strong awareness that there were red flags, right? Like I had learned that my partner had lied about, something pretty significant very early on. But because that love bombing was so delicious and seductive and quite literally was satisfying a need that had gone dormant for so long, we're always doing this like cost benefit analysis with our relationships, right? And so when the good stuff is so good, of course, when there are these red flags, it can be very easy to make them into more like pink flags, right? You can start to say to yourself, well, it's not that bad because of X, Y, and Z. And so even though I was incredibly aware that there were these parts of him that gave me pause, the good stuff more than balanced it out in the beginning.
That's why I think it's so important to chat about this with other mental health professionals because we feel like, oh, this can't happen to me. I'm used to recognizing red flags when we're in it, it's just much different. Let me go back a little bit. I'm back to the attachment style. How do you think that influenced your reactions during the relationship when these pink flags and these highs lows are happening?
Yeah. So I've been in a lot of relationships in my life. And so what's been so nice about that is really understanding when my attachment style gets activated, right? When I become more anxious or when I become more disorganized, right? Like I know what it feels like to have a secure partner. And unfortunately, for so many of us who grew up in abusive situations, security can feel boring. It can feel like, wait, where's the razzle dazzle? Right. And so this felt incredibly exciting and, like I said, seductive. Right. And so that's definitely what I was experiencing. And in the love bombing phase, because there was such an intensity of connection, I also felt relatively secure because I felt like, oh, I know where I'm at. Right. Then, when he started to slowly pull away, become more avoidant, when the disappointments started to compound on themselves, that's when my anxiety grew. And what's so important about that is that more often than not, when people don't understand or validate their attachment style, they tell themselves they're being crazy or too dramatic or making too big of a thing. But what was incredibly helpful for me was understanding that it wasn't my fault that I was feeling this way, that I needed to pay attention, that I needed to start communicating my needs. And that's what ultimately allowed me to, even though I was in the relationship, it allowed me to have this sort of second level of awareness, to be watching what was happening as it was happening, to take note of what the patterns ultimately became.
Right, right. And I know what kind you mentioned in one of your blogs, what kept you grounded were these 6 questions. You had this framework in your mind. I want you kind of, if you can run down those questions, like how did those questions help you to navigate that fog? Because it can become very foggy with the ups and downs. Can you share just how those answers to those questions, how they came about for you?
So I created the 6 questions out of this need that I was realizing that, so much of what I help folks with is their relationships, but what I started noticing was that I needed to help people's relationships to themselves in order to help them help their relationships with others. And what I mean by that is, like, the first question is, have I communicated a need? Now, if you're a people pleaser, if you struggle with self-neglect, you might not even know you have needs, right? So you would have to start there. Do I even know what my needs are? That's step one. And then, have I communicated a need? So because I've done a lot of work in relationships, I know pretty clearly the type of relationships that I like, that I want. I want consistency, I want transparency. And so when I started to feel anxiety, I started to say to myself, okay, what are my needs? And have I communicated those needs? And then once that was true, right? Once I felt like, okay, I've really been clear with what I'm looking for, then I started to go into these secondary questions around, well, what's my part of the pattern? What do I have to change, right? If I'm anxious, can I work on self-soothing my anxiety so that I can be doing part of the part of my work? What ultimately helped me realize in the 6 questions was that I was in a pattern of, I was with someone who constantly made me feel heard, right? So that second question is, do I feel heard? And he did a beautiful job each time making me feel heard. But what I ended up realizing, and obviously it takes time to realize this, is that even in his accountability, there were no behaviors to back it up. So those later on questions of, is it enough? Is there evidence of change? Those were the questions that I was continually coming back to say, okay, I've communicated this need a couple of times. I want it to be more integrated into his life. He said he heard me. Is
Mhm.
it happening? Is it happening in a reasonable way, in a reasonable amount? And the answer ultimately at the end of the year we spent together was just simply no.
Most of us in mental health and helping professionals are really great at that communication
Right.
piece. And you're getting all the signs that he's taking it in. But then the action part is where you kind of, a part of your questions that grounded you back.
It wasn't happening, even though each time we would talk about it, I would walk away feeling like he gets it.
And what was that turning point when you decided I need to set a boundary here? How did you balance the emotional connection and attachment that's happening with just realizing that you're not getting essentially what you needed out of that relationship?
So in the last month that we were together, the abuse ramped way up. When someone is trauma bonded, what that means is we get addicted to the highs and lows, right? In the same way that people get addicted to slot machines. And so that last month was incredibly difficult because not only was I not getting some of those core needs met that I had been communicating, but the day-to-day experience of relating to him had become so anxiety producing that it literally was not sustainable. He would go dark for 24 hours, 36 hours, make excuses. He was totally shut down. He started accusing me of things that I would have never done. He would vacillate between that total accountability and then sort of saying, like, what do you mean? I can't ask you if you've been with other people. What do you mean I can't X, Y, and Z? And so that gut feeling that I'm often tied to was constantly just saying to me, like, this doesn't feel right. The day before I ended it, I was throwing a dinner party. I was with a bunch of my friends, and he was really monopolizing my time by texting me. And I had started to realize that when I wasn't with him, he had me in constant communication, but then when it was time for us to actually spend time together, he would cancel abruptly with no apologies and just sort of like, what do you want from me? It was in that moment that I really realized, like, oh, this person is manipulating my time in this way that is not just someone being avoidant, it's also someone being abusive. And so in the next morning, we were supposed to spend the weekend together. And I remember taking my phone into the shower in case he called. And I had this moment of like, I'm taking my phone into the shower in case this man calls. That that does not feel normal and healthy. And I was so afraid that if I hadn't gotten that call, because he had gone dark for 24 hours, 36 hours at a time, I had no idea when I was going to hear from him again. And I just knew, I think about my niece who was like 6 months old at that time. And I had thought about, like, gosh, what would I feel like if she were with a partner like this when she's my age? And I didn't want that for her. And so I didn't want it for me.
And that's such insight. That's brilliant to think of your niece. We're protective of those that we love, and then turning that around towards yourself and like, what's making me accept this for myself? That's beautiful insight to have. And then the strength that it took as well.
I had already left a 13-year marriage. That was a beautiful relationship, right? And so I had this really strong feeling of like, if I can leave that and break my own heart in that way and leave and heal and know my worth, there's no way in hell I'm going to put up with this. I've already done hard stuff. I don't need to keep doing hard stuff. In my next relationship, I want it to be wonderful and expansive and calm and peaceful. And so I just knew that even though I loved him and really did believe, like, oh my God, this is my person, I knew I deserved more than what I was currently experiencing in that moment.
I know that you mentioned trauma bonds. It sounds very similar to addiction, right? When you relate it to gambling or any other addiction. But how did you navigate that pull? Because when there's that bond, there's a pull, of course. I'm sure some hoovering began of some sort. And how did you navigate that?
People come into my practice all the time talking about phone addiction, and they feel so much shame around, like, why can't I just stop scrolling? And the first thing I'll say to them is, this phone was created to addict us. These apps were created to addict us. It is not a moral failure that you're addicted to this phone. And I think that's where we have to start. We have to understand that a trauma bond isn't a moral failure on my part because I'm weak or dumb. It's a dynamic that I experienced in childhood, that inconsistent attachment. And so I already know it as familiar. I already know that when we've experienced trauma in childhood, we subconsciously look for it to heal in our romantic partnership. So I knew I was doing it, and so I treated it as if I needed to go to rehab and detox and withdrawal. My cognition around it wasn't like, what the hell is wrong with me? Why do I miss him? He hurt me. It was like, of course I miss him. Of course, I want that hit. Of course, I'm struggling to step away because that's the nature of addiction and abuse.
I love that grace that you give yourself because it allows those listening as well to not beat themselves up over it. And that's so empowering as well because a relationship like this can really shake you to the core. And it does bring up our past wounds, like you mentioned, childhood experiences with these patterns. Ultimately, would you say they also empowered you to leave?
Absolutely, right? Because I've done all the inner child healing where it's like, I know why I went there. I know why I sought this dynamic out, but I also know that I'm not a kid anymore. I get to parent myself now. And so I had this really spiritual understanding of like, it's up to me to parent myself now. It's up to me to walk away. And if I don't walk away, then I'm part of what's hurting me. I think sometimes that can feel very victim blaming, but unfortunately, we have to be the ones to set the boundaries. And, in the stages of hoovering, which occurred afterwards and was probably one of the hardest parts for me, it was really in continually coming back to myself to say, I know I want to go back, but I also know what's waiting for me when I get there.
You kind of, in a sense, knew the ending to the story, right? And that's something to keep in mind is if I go back, I know what it will eventually cause, right? And kind of breaking that cycle.
Sitting in that ambivalence, sitting in that feeling of wanting to do something, but knowing it's bad for you, and letting that discomfort exist and take up space and not feel like I have to do anything to fix it because it is inherently uncomfortable to break patterns, break habits. Some of the hardest work that any of us can and will do in our lives.
And then as mental health therapists and clinicians and working in this field, we think about change. That's ultimately what we try to do in our 9 to 5s, right? But in your experience, how much does someone with narcissistic tendencies or traits, how much change can possibly happen over time? And like, how do we come to terms with the fact that sometimes we don't know how much change was actually possible?
To this day, I don't know what's possible for my ex. I know what it looks like when someone's in my practice and they want to change. And I know what it looks like when someone's in my practice and they're having resistance to change, right? So it's so hard to say what makes the change possible? I've worked with people in their 70s, and so many people would feel like, oh, people are set in their ways by X age. And that's just simply not true. I'm an eternal optimist in that I think change is truly possible. I think if I didn't think that, I probably wouldn't be able to do this job. Popular literature out there is very strong in saying that narcissists don't change. Part of what I struggle with in that take is that not everyone we're working with is full blown narcissistic. Some people have narcissistic tendencies. Some people are children of narcissists, and so they take on narcissistic traits, right? That's how narcissists are not born, they're made. And so I want to believe that because not everyone is a full blown narcissist, that there are many people on the spectrum, and therefore change is on a spectrum. I have to believe that because I just think that's a better way to move through the world.
And I believe that wholeheartedly as well. I think, like you said, it's really hard to do our job if we don't believe that. And then sometimes that's the mindset that can keep us stuck. I love that you committed to self-love and that guided you to making an ultimate choice to choose yourself. Right. And that's one of the hardest things. But my last question is like for those that are currently struggling and seeing patterns within their own relationship, these narcissistic tendencies in the partner that they're currently with, what would you say to them? How can they begin the process of recognizing red flags, pink flags, everything in between, and then building that strength to leave?
First of all, think about what part of the phase you're in, right? Like what I needed to do in hoovering was very different than what I needed to do in the discard and the devaluing stage, right? Hoovering was about reprogramming my brain, leaning heavily on self-care, informing myself of my legal rights. It was about writing. It was about under, understanding what I went through from an intellectual level, right? So I distinctly remember like my first domestic violence training ever that I took. I remember them writing like on the board why people leave, why people should leave. And then I remember us writing on the board why people stay in abusive relationships, and it was like 5 times longer, meaning that there are so many reasons why people stay in abusive relationships, and they're really good freaking reasons, right? There's immigration status, there's economic, financial support. Abusers will often threaten custody, taking away the kids. Oftentimes, abusers are telling the kids if your mom or your dad takes away you, it's going to be her fault or his fault, right? So, like, there's all these really insidious ways that make people stay. I never want to come from a place of saying, like, if you're being abused, you have to leave, because I understand the realities of the situation that many people have to stay in some sort of form of relationship with abusive people. What I would say is, try and really get support. If you can't afford therapy, listen to podcasts, get books on the subject, build your self knowledge, and really start to listen to what the impacts of being in this relationship are. Because I think a lot of times we think, we're strong, we can handle it. But they've done studies where people of narcissistic abuse have all sorts of autoimmune diseases. They have skin diseases. They have chronic pain. Those high levels of stress show up in our bodies in different ways. And so even if we think we're quote unquote fine, what you might be ignoring are some of these very loud body cues that are telling you you're not safe. The brain fog that I experienced, especially during the hoovering, the cognitive dissonance, all of those intense mental and emotional impacts are real. We all sort of have to decide, what choices do you want to make in your life? When you're on your deathbed, I think the deathbed question is a perfect question. What regrets will you have? It's a really nice way to clarify for you, how do you want to live your one life that you're given? And for me, I just knew I didn't want to spend another moment doing work that was no longer for me. Didn't matter if there was an immense amount of love there. It didn't matter if we could have made it work. I just knew I wasn't willing to do this type of work anymore in my life. And that just requires you to have a silent conversation, maybe over and over again with yourself. Maybe you decide, I think I want to go, but you don't actually leave until 8 months or 18 years.
Right. And I think that's important to note is that leaving relationships like this because of the trauma bond. And it's interesting that you mentioned the physical reaction to these relationships because it is like re-traumatizing ourselves. So that trauma bond, I mean, all these words can seem very drastic, but it's exactly what is happening and leaving that cycle. It truly takes a few attempts and a few tries as well. The first doesn't always stick because there's just so much happening and so many reasons why, as you listed, people may be staying.
We all have to decide when it's time to make that change, and neither you nor I can do it for anyone else.
I love all of the suggestions, therapy included, but also just the tools that you can find online, on YouTube, and then books too. So one more time, I really want to give you space to plug once again your book.
So it's called Healing Relational Trauma. It's out on May 1st, and you can pre-order it, and you definitely should pre-order it right now from Amazon. I also have another book called Couples Therapy Activity Book, and that's a wonderful book as well, that if you're in a partnership or you want to build intimacy with any of the relationships in your life, they're just fun, evidence-based activities to build connection, build trust. So definitely check that one out too.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Melissa is the modern relationship expert, and we see why. In this interview, I've had so much fun talking to you and just really talking about a subject that I think more of us need to have, especially in this realm amongst other mental health professionals, social workers, counselors. I think it is more common, and it's something that there is a fear around kind of going there and talking about it. So that's why I thank you so much for creating these resources and chatting with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again for tuning in. New episodes of Heart of the Case drop every single week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on YouTube Podcast.